It's a real pleasure to welcome an international expert on housing finance, Dr. David Paul Rosen, to deliver a keynote address. Dr. Rosen is a recognised authority in the fields of affordable housing finance, inclusionary housing, redevelopment, real estate economics, sustainable development and renewable energy. And David is a practitioner. He's not just a thinker and a talker about these stuff. He knows how to deliver these sorts of outcomes. He has represented public and private sector clients around the world, including the World Bank, European Mortgage Federation, United States Federal Home Loan Bank System, and many others. In recent years, he's provided numerous briefings to the Obama White House and senior administration officials in half a dozen agencies. Dr. Rosen will be presenting a compelling case for attracting greater private sector investment into affordable housing, providing practical examples from the United States, and identifying opportunities and possible solutions for Australia. Will you please welcome to the stage and make him feel very welcome, Dr. David Paul Rosen.
Thank you for that warm. It's such a pleasure to be here. I told Ian yesterday morning I did the math, and had we a similar aggregation of housing practitioners and advocates in the United States proportionate to our population in a single room, we would need to house 12,000 attendees. So Ian, congratulations on getting the tech right. Yeah, on the attendance. Before I start my remarks, I need to ask for your help. So I want you to pause for a second and conjure up a memory from your childhood when you were home, in your house, your ranch, your flat, and think about one memory that made you feel happy, where you felt safe and secure, cared for. Maybe it was at the dinner table with your parents, maybe it was pestering your little brother, having friends over for dinner or playing in the backyard or reading before you went to bed. And I want you to hold on to that memory of what it felt like to be safe and secure in your house, in your home. And I want to call up that memory at the end of our remarks today. And the second thing I'd like to do to ask your assistance on is I'd like you all of us please to stand up. This is not going to be morning exercise, but let's just stand up for a second. And I want to look around the room, and I want us to imagine that all of us in attendance at this conference represent the 560,000 renters in Australia in the bottom quintile of incomes who are renting. Okay? This is your population of Q1 renters, I think, as you refer to them, Ian. Now, if your birthday was after March 14th, please sit down. Those whose birthdays are before March 14th, I'm not going to ask people's age here, okay? My mom brought me up to be more polite than that. But now look at around the room and who's remaining standing. You can afford your home. The rest of us who are seated cannot. You're priced out of the market. This is a fundamental reality of housing economics as it applies to affordable housing. And this is the problem we're going to talk about solving today. Thank you very much. So, I haven't started. So Ian has asked me to cover 179 topics in 32 minutes. Tough taskmaster. We're going to talk about 4 things this morning. I want to highlight 4 cases of success, and I'm defining success here in the production of hundreds of thousands of affordable owner and renter units. I want to talk about the policy and practice requirements for that success. I want to detail with you 3 financing vehicles that have produced it. And I want to end by talking about 6 key lessons that we have learned. And I'm pretty humbled coming here from the United States. After all, we're the country who, our gift to you was the mortgage, the great financial crisis and the subprime mortgage crisis. So for me to stand here today and talk about lessons learned, part of, I think, what's important to learn here is not repeating our mistakes. And it will be useful to talk about those as well. The cases that I'm going to be reviewing for you are New York City, California redevelopment tax increment financing, the creation of state and local housing trust funds as permanent sources of revenue for subsidizing affordable housing, and inclusionary housing. The requirements for a successful policy and practice, without which we can't produce these units, include defining what we mean by affordable housing quantitatively, quantifying, I'm an economist after all, quantifying the needs demographically and from a market perspective for housing, quantifying, once again, the economic financial gap for those of us who sat down in that birthday exercise so that we can bridge that financial gap, and lastly, implementing land value capture policies to work in tandem with public subsidies and public revenue sources to fill that gap. The three cases we're going to talk about are the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. How many of you have heard of that program? So we're going to learn a bit about that today. The second is Redevelopment Tax Increment Financing. How many of you have heard of this? Fewer. And the third is inclusionary zoning, land value capture. To foreshadow the lessons, because I think it's important to keep them in mind, we need to define what we mean by affordable housing at the risk of being repetitive. We need to create a permanent, annually renewable source of public capital, I would suggest at every level of government, federal, state, and local, to work in tandem. We need to create public-private partnerships that are durable and that have institution and capacity building at their core. I'm talking about a practice that will probably take 1 to 2 decades to put into place. We need to implement land value capture policies and strategies and be much more astute, as the Prime Minister himself suggested this month in Queensland. When we make an investment of public infrastructure, or we zone land and create uplift, there needs to be some recompense for community benefit and community need. And if we start thinking about affordable housing, especially rental housing, as key community infrastructure, that then becomes part of the land value capture agenda. We need to treat affordable rental housing, privately owned and operated, such as those of you who are operating 90,000 units among community housing providers, as permanently affordable, not something that is at risk of financial failure or failure to invest in a long, useful life. And we need to resolve the ambiguities of affordable home ownership. The most stunning example of a success in urban housing policy is New York City. When Mayor Michael Bloomberg was elected in 2002, he declared the new housing marketplace plan goal of producing 165,000 units of affordable renter and owner housing, supported by a $7.5 billion expenditure of city funds. When the dust settled in 2014, he'd exceeded his goal, 175,000 units, $8.5 billion just capital from the city of New York alone. 2/3 of this production was to preserve previously subsidized housing where the rent restrictions were burned off or expiring. Remember I said permanent affordability for affordable housing. This is one of the biggest mistakes in U.S. housing policy. We invest billions of dollars in affordable rental housing, privately owned and operated, but we do so for a short period of time, 20, 30 years. What happens at that time? The housing is at risk of converting to market rate, evicting the low-income tenants with no place to go. Hugely costly to resubsidize. 70% of the tenure was rental, 30% was home ownership. 80%, 76% of the units were affordable to families below 80% of the area median income. The median income in New York City in 2014 for a family of 4, $83,900. Bloomberg, who comes from Wall Street after all, created a capital plan, a 10-year plan which said transparently where this money was going to be spent, the uses. There will be a quiz on this, and I'm not an easy grader. And the sources. The numbers aren't particularly important, but what is important is to know that hard economics undergirt this capital plan, and it was public. And he was held accountable for delivering the units against this plan. Without this capital plan, roadmap, the units would not have been produced, and I commend this strategy to your consideration. Not to be outdone, Bill de Blasio was elected mayor last year. One of the first things he did upon taking office was aim to produce 200,000 units, on top of the 160,000 produced by Bloomberg, 175,000, at a total capital expense of $41 billion. This was to be allocated 3/4 to new construction and 1/4 to preservation, that old problem once again. But look at this chart. 3/4 of that $40 billion in capital came from who? The private sector, lenders, institutional investors, corporate investors, who expect a market rate of return on their capital and who expect at tolerable levels of risk. And they got it. The distribution here was 60% of the units were preservation, once again, 40% new construction. The income targeting in de Blasio's plan is a bit lower than income targeting in Bloomberg's plan. You see they added a category at the top there of extremely low income, about 10% of the units. These are families below 30% of the area median income, close to your Q1 level in Australia. While this chart may be hard for some of you to read, this is an example of what I mean by quantifying the definition of affordable housing. So here we have the labels in the left-hand column, which are rhetorical and may conjure up negative stereotypes, very low income, extremely low income. We could have more positive labels like workforce housing or key worker housing. But until we define those labels by income levels, as you see on the right-hand column, we can't develop housing and we can't finance it. Because what's central to that is the definition of affordable rent, as you see in the second column to the right. Despite this massive production, really historic in U.S. standards for a city, it's important to remember that New York faces grievous challenges. The New York City Housing Authority owns and operates 175,000 units of social housing, or what we call public housing, representing a $14 billion capital deficit of deferred maintenance and a $1.1 billion projected accrued operating deficit. This is a broken business model, and it needs to be repaired and reinvested in. We actually heard Minister Porter talk about the concerns about the social housing stock here in Australia. Some 320,000 units remaining in social housing ownership after a transfer of about 80,000, do I have that right, to community housing providers. So you're facing a similar problem as New York. My point here is that despite this massive investment, New York still faces considerable challenges. The second case is redevelopment tax increment financing, which in my home state of California we've used extensively for decades. This has produced more than 100,000 units of affordable owner and renter housing in a 17-year period, averaging about 5,000 to 8,000 units a year in a state with a population of 36 million. This chart, while hard to read, shows the trends of annual cash flow being deposited into more than 450 redevelopment agencies by 2010. That figure was $1.6 billion a year in annual cash flow dedicated to the production and preservation of affordable housing. And here you see the unit production. What's important about this chart, which covers 30 years, is it's counter-cyclical. So when we invest in low-income housing, below market rate housing, we're avoiding the real estate cycles that market real estate production is faced with. This helps support employment, jobs, and a source of continuing investment despite economic cycles. In the 1980s, the federal government in my country retreated from its commitment to affordable housing after decades of support. And that left the states and the cities scrambling for new capital. One of the key strategies that states used was the creation of a housing trust fund, a dedicated source of revenue, public source of revenue, reinvested in the production and preservation of affordable housing. As of 2007, there were more than 600 state, local, and county trust funds in the United States, generating nearly $2 billion a year in annual cash flow. 40 of the 50 states in my country have housing trust funds, generating about $1 billion a year among themselves. Another 600 plus local trust funds match that with about a similar amount. Housing trust funds are an important way to declare a public commitment to the long-term investment in housing, both renter and owner. Inclusionary housing is simply the requirement that a percentage of market rate housing development be set aside as affordable to targeted income levels for both owners and renters. And in California, once again, a state with a strong commitment to affordable housing, we've used this strategy extensively. In 2003, 107 jurisdictions had adopted local governments, inclusionary housing requirements, mandatory obligations, that had produced 34,000 units of affordable renter and owner housing. By 2011, the number of cities and counties participating was 160, and the unit production was running upwards of 10,000 a year. What's interesting about this map, and I realize it's a little bit hard to see, but this is a map of California, and the dots represent the city's location for inclusionary. And you can see they're clustered in high market areas around the San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego basins along the coast. Inclusionary housing is most effective in high-cost markets. That would be Sydney, Melbourne. It was interesting to hear from the minister yesterday that prices here in Perth have recently gone down, I imagine because of strains and stresses in the resource industry occasioned by a slowdown in China. So we see a relationship to economic cycles and housing price. As I said, these are mandatory programs. It's not a wish, it's not a voluntary suggestion. And the average unit set aside was 13%. Fully 20% of jurisdictions, 1 out of 5, required 1/4, 25% of market rate production be affordable. In my hometown of San Francisco, 30% of residential production must be produced at low income levels. Income targeting in inclusionary housing, for renters, it's overwhelming at the low income level, not the very low income level. So that range between 50 and 80% of area median income, or forgive the acronym, which I'm probably going to lapse into, AMI, area median income. And owner housing targeted at moderate rate levels. And we'll look at what that means by way of gap in a minute. What do these 4 cases have in common? What did they do to be successful? They defined their terms by affordable housing. They quantified need in terms of market and demographics. They financially calculated the financing gap for affordable housing at every income level for both owners and renters, and the homeless, I might add. They committed permanent, dedicated sources of revenue, and they were very savvy and astute about their land and zoning policies. So, who are we developing affordable housing for? Well, I suggest to you that we define affordable housing as the cost of renting or owning relative to household income adjusted by household size. And that we define affordable housing expense as a percentage of area median income of that income level, again, adjusted for household size. So that for renters, this is very established policy in the United States, stretching back more than 30 years. Affordable housing expense represents 30% of gross pre-tax household income for rent plus an allowance for utilities. 30% rent and utilities. For owners, there's some variability here, but I would say broad practice, 35% of gross household income, again pre-tax. For a bunch of acronyms here, PITI, PMI, HOA, that'll be on the quiz. Mortgage, principal and interest, taxes and insurance. Property mortgage insurance when we have low down payment, and homeowner association dues. The next step in success is quantifying need. Unless we understand our market, we can't really effectively intervene in the market. And we need to do this in terms of demographics and real estate markets. My firm was asked to go to Richmond, Virginia, a state in the southern United States of about a population of 250,000, 80,000 households, and develop a comprehensive housing strategy. And we started with this foundational research of housing need and quantifying it. And what we found was pretty distressing. So Richmond has hollowed out the middle class. These bars represent distribution of households by income, and you can see fully 1/3 of Richmond families are poor, earning less than $25,000 a year. And there's very little by way of middle-income households in the city of Richmond. Interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, rents in Richmond are not that high. So the right-hand column is market rent. And you can see that a 1 and a 2 bedroom unit rents for $800 and $900 a year. And this was just last year, by the way, in Richmond. These are pretty current numbers. So we would be foolish to target scarce public taxpayer dollars to subsidize low-income families at 80% of area median income, that middle column, because under that definition of affordable housing expense, they can afford more than the market rent. So we want to target our scarce resources to the very low income, particularly in this community. That equation might be different in San Francisco or New York, where you have a high-cost market. But perhaps even more distressing in Richmond was the number of households experiencing severe housing stress, what we call severe cost burden, paying more than half their meager income for rent. And you can see that 8,000 families are below 30% of area median income, paying half that for rent. And another 2,400 families are between 30 and 50% AMI, paying more than half of the rent. These are severely cost-burdened households, 12% of the population of Richmond. The public housing inventory is an important asset for the community, representing almost 4,000 units, but 2/3 of that inventory is more than 50 years old and is failing because it has not been maintained and reinvested in over time. Richmond has been successful in attracting federal subsidies for the production of affordable housing developed by for-profit and nonprofit private developers. But remember this problem of having limited time restrictions on affordability? So of the 11,000 subsidized units in Richmond, 6,000 of them will have their affordability restrictions burn off in the next 4 years. And another 5,000 will lose those restrictions in the next 9 years. Richmond is facing some serious needs. So we know how we define affordability. We know what the quantified needs are. Now we need to identify the housing gap. And I define the affordable housing finance gap as the difference between the cost of developing or procuring a unit for rent or for ownership and what a household can afford to pay for that unit in terms of rent or house price based on the definitions we just looked at. So in one community in the San Francisco Bay Area, Hayward, with an area median income of $93,500 for a family of 4, we calculated affordable rent and affordable home ownership. And just to summarize the charts, and we can go into the numbers in more detail in the Q&A, when we applied that 30% standard, we see that a very low-income family can afford a rent of $1,100 in Hayward, and a moderate-income family can afford a rent of $2,500. We did the same calculation for affordable house price. So we took 35% of area median income, adjusted it by the income level we're targeting, and we end up with a small down payment, 3%, of an affordable price of $200,000 for a low-income family and $420,000 for a moderate-income family, income of $110,000. Well, how does this stack up to the cost of delivering or procuring a unit in Hayward? A newly constructed owner townhome, 2-bedroom, modest unit, costs about $480,000 to construct with developer profit. When we subtract the affordable price for these income levels, we see that the, and forgive me, I do want to highlight this. So you can see the affordable gap per unit for a low-income family is $280,000, and we still have a gap, even with that family at $110,000 of $60,000. The gap to price, that is the last row, talks about what it would cost to simply go in the marketplace and buy a unit. And you can see that those gaps are even higher, $390,000 for a low-income family, $180,000 for a moderate-income family. The renter gap, doing the same economic analysis, capitalizing affordable rent, $153,000 per unit in capital subsidy financing gap for a 2-bedroom apartment for a very low-income family at 50% AMI. And you can see there's no gap for the market rate apartment at the moderate income level, right? So we defined affordable housing. We quantified our needs in demographic and market terms. We've used fundamental real estate economics to calculate the financing gap for renters and owners. And what do we find? We find a need for public subsidy. And so we need to create permanent, dedicated sources of revenue. And I want to suggest to you that there are 4 classes of revenue that we should be thinking about. Tax subsidies, budgetary appropriations, bonding, and private sector partner capital that's leveraged for debt and equity. Tax subsidies are the crazy ant in the basement. We never think about it. It's invisible. It's not budgeted. It's not on the budget for the federal government or the state government, but it occurs as a tax expense, a tax expenditure to Treasury. It's real. In the United States, we spend massively to subsidize home ownership in a very regressive fashion. Similarly, here in Australia, I'm just beginning to learn the complexities of your own negative gearing and capital gains tax deferral. But I think that figure is in excess of $4 billion a year, which ironically is about what you're paying in budgetary outlays for Commonwealth rent assistance. So it's critically important that we be very smart about tax reform, and I gather this is a current debate in Australia, so this is very timely for you. Tax credits, tax deductions, tax abatements, and tax exclusions or exemptions. We can talk about each of those in the Q&A, and we're going to talk about one of them, tax credits, in some detail. Budgetary appropriations can come from the general fund. They can come from pledged revenues, such as GST or tax increment or hotel bed tax or other sources of public assessment. They can come from one-time developer contributions assessed in the form of impact fees. And they can represent pledgeable public assets. You may remember in that New York City sources and uses budget of Mayor Bloomberg, he had a $1.2 billion contribution from the New York City Housing Development Corporation. Well, HDC is a public instrumentality of the City of New York, and it generated that net worth over a couple decades of practice. When you reach that level of maturity, you're going to be generating public assets which can be pledged for renewed production as well. Bonds, I understand here in Australia, perhaps imperfectly, are underutilized, not a common practice. We have a multi-trillion-dollar bond market in the United States. This is common daily practice for us to bring institutional investors at scale to finance and procure key infrastructure, which I would suggest to you includes especially rental housing. General obligation bonds, a pledge of the general fund. Revenue bonds, repaid from revenue from a project like rent. Special assessment district bonds, repaid from property assessments on properties in a defined geographic area. Tax increment, we'll talk about in detail. And social impact bonds, I was very interested to hear Minister Porter talk about those, and that's an emerging practice in the United States as well, particularly valuable for those with heavy social and special needs. Remember in Bloomberg's plan and de Blasio's plan that 3/4 of the capital, $30 billion out of $40 billion, came from the private sector? We need lenders and investors to provide debt, term debt, equity capital. The superannuation funds in Australia should be financing partners in this institutional class of assets that we would hope to create. Insurance companies also have appetite for long-term patient capital. And I'm not sure of the size and scale of your philanthropic sector in Australia, but in the United States, foundations played a key role over a 20-year period in building up the capacity of what you would call here the community housing sector. And I commend that case study to you for study. So when we collect this revenue, this public capital, the trust fund is, as a renewable source, a very strong political statement of will that you're annually renewing those commitments. And you can see in the United States we've used a whole host, a Pandora's box of taxes and fees that are pledged to capitalize housing trust funds. So we can be very creative about the kinds of revenues that we're putting into our trust fund. And lastly, we zone land. If we think about downtown Melbourne or downtown Sydney or Perth for that matter, 30 years ago, and we think about the values contained that long ago, it would almost be impossible to imagine the real estate values that we see today. But as we zone for that growth, we're creating immense value. And we should be astute about capturing a portion of that value without over-tipping financial feasibility of the for-profit development. And we're going to talk about that in detail again. But the types of land value capture strategies include not only inclusionary housing, but the trading of development incentives like density bonuses and design code reforms like reduction in parking near transit for affordable requirements, development of air rights over publicly owned land, and the creation of public and private trading markets for the transfer of development rights. So let's look at 3 cases briefly. The low-income housing tax credit program was adopted in the United States in 1986. It provides a credit for corporate investors to invest in qualified housing projects that set aside units at specified rent levels and that require those units be occupied by families at specified income levels for a period of time, 30 to 55 years. This is the single most productive low-income rental housing production program in U.S. history. We have produced 2.6 million units of tax credit housing, privately owned, operated, and developed, 110,000 units a year, a tax expenditure of $7.3 billion a year, 1,400 projects a year, nearly 40,000 projects overall, and importantly, 1/4 of that total was developed by nonprofits. And equally importantly, 3/4 was developed by for-profit developers. This clearly is a viable business model. And not only that, we are now seeing internal rates of return for corporate investment in the 4 to 5% range with a 15-year term. That is very, very good. Equally impressively, the foreclosure rate on this $2.6 million portfolio from 1998 to 2010 is 0.5%. That is the best performing real estate asset class in the United States, bar none. The structure is complicated. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how we structure these, but we can go into it in the Q&A, or is it the Shark Tank, Ian, or I'm definitely afraid of sharks. But simply put, state allocating agencies award tax credits in a very competitive system to developers who then sell their credits to investors, in its most simple term. But there are real benefits to this structure. It injects market discipline with public-private partnerships to develop real assets. It enforces compliance with tax penalty. If you develop an affordable rental housing project with tax credits and you fail to comply with the occupancy and rent restriction, the state allocated agency will recapture tax penalties from your investor, and your investor, as your developer, will thread that obligation back to you. So there's a virtuous circle of enforcement. And this is done by third-party oversight through annual audit of both compliance and financial performance. This transparent market, while starting at very high rates of return, frankly unsustainable, has become very efficient, as I said, in its pricing. And one important feature to remember here is that the credit price is driven by the value of the tax credit, not by the value of the real estate. And what that means is that the investor is earning their return from the tax credit, not the real estate. That allows for the developer to have the investor exit without destabilizing the project at the end of the compliance period. In our country, 30 to 70% of total development cost is paid for by the credit. That's a function of pricing and rent levels, and you can scale that up or down here in Australia as you like. This requires several principles: a state allocating agency with real estate underwriting and asset management expertise, corporate taxpayers willing to trade their tax liability for investment in qualifying projects, capable developers, nonprofit and for-profit alike, to develop, finance, build, and operate this asset for a long time, intermediary investment managers to intermediate the investments, and capital sources such as debt and subsidy, as we saw in the financing gap, to leverage and match what's remaining that's not covered by the tax credit. A couple of issues to keep in mind. Please assure long-term, if not permanent, affordability. The original program was for 15 years, woefully, ridiculously short. Today it's 30 years. In my home state, the minimum requirement is 55 years. I would suggest that that isn't long enough. But you need to provide for property reinvestment every 10 to 15 years so we don't repeat the mistake of public housing, or we decline over time and we fall far behind the curve. Estimates in the United States is that the capital deficit for public housing, 1.4 million units, exceeds $200 billion. We need to remember that the equity is subordinate to debt, so it's at risk, and that helps enforce this virtuous circle of creditworthiness. And aim for a credit efficiency goal of 90%. And by that I mean 90% of that tax expenditure dollar, that $7.3 billion, finds its way into the housing, not into investor or syndicator return. A second case, tax increment redevelopment financing. What is redevelopment? It's a tool used by local government to remediate blight, encourage economic development, invest in infrastructure, and produce affordable housing. It allows for public and private parties, both developers and investors and lenders, to enter into partnership. It declares the debt obligations of those agencies as separate from the general obligations of the city, so these are instrumentalities that stand and fall on their own balance sheet and performance. And it provides a terrific form of flexibility. And what is tax increment? Tax increment, and we'll see an illustration in a moment, is the growth in tax revenue collections, property tax collections, in a delineated geographic area resulting from increases in the assessed value of properties in that area. So it is not an increase in the tax rate, and it is not the imposition of a new tax. It is naturally occurring growth from new construction, infill development, major rehabilitation, and property transfers and sale. It's predictable, provides a long-term source of cash flow, 30-plus years, and it supports a secure and prudent debt structure, which we can look at here. And once again, I want to emphasize these are local agencies under local control, but without a recourse to the city's balance sheet. There are some credit issues that we would want to be careful about in structuring tax increment bonds. I want to defer that to the Q&A. It's a bit technical, perhaps, for this quick overview. But briefly, a tax increment bond is a long-term debt obligation repaid by revenues from increases in assessed value in the project area. And these bond proceeds are used to revitalize blighted areas and produce affordable housing. So let's look at an example. So this is a California city, and I know the numbers in the back are hard to read, forgive me, but we're looking at a 30-year clock from 2007 to 2037, and you can see that in year one, property tax collections in this jurisdiction were just about $3 million a year. The bond issued in 2002, the green debt service bars, had debt service of $1.8 million against $2.8 million in receipts, so about a 1 to 2 debt coverage ratio, very strong debt coverage. This produced about $35 million in proceeds to spend on low-income housing in year one. And then later in 2006, with the orange bar and the yellow bars, the jurisdiction issued a second senior subordinate bond, which added about another $1 million in debt service, still far below the red line. The red line is the projected total tax receipts growing over 30 years. So you can see that they're prudently far below total collections. This resulted in a total of about $50 million in bond proceeds for the production of affordable housing in what, in this case, is actually a very small city. I think the population was about 80,000. My last case for you today is land value capture from upzoning, from densification. And I want to talk in particular about the downtown plan for the city of Long Beach, California. Long Beach is on the coast. Anybody know Long Beach? My guess is not too many of you. It's 400,000 population, adjacent to Los Angeles, connected by light rail, about a 20-minute ride. A major port, perhaps the largest port on the Pacific coast of the United States, big driver of the economy. And it's a tourist destination because of its coastal location. It's actually kind of weird, frankly, because you've got a tourist destination in a port. So personally, I don't think it works that well, but a lot of people like it. Some people like Disneyland, some people don't. When LA put in the light rail connecting Long Beach and LA, the city of Long Beach realized that they needed to upzone and modernize their downtown. And so they set about to do that. And it's similar to what Australian cities are doing. So in the last 6 months, I've been working with the Future Cities Collaborative out of the University of Sydney with jurisdictions like Pittwater and Canada Bay. Anybody from Pittwater, Canada Bay today? Cool. Mona Vale or Canada Bay? Okay. So Pittwater is seeking to redevelop the Mona Vale Town Center with a plan that calls for about 500 new units of housing, 40,000 square meters of office, and another 17,000 square meters of retail. And they're recognizing that that represents a value uplift. More to the point, Canada Bay. Anyone from Canada Bay? So the council, as you know, has declared its intention to impose a mandatory inclusionary housing obligation on Rhodes East. Now, Rhodes East, those of you familiar with the city, is currently sort of a mix of industrial low-density uses. Under the new plan, not 2,800 units, but I understand from discussions with New South Wales Planning, we're talking now about as many as 4,500 units in Rhodes East. So a major uplift in the number of unit production. This is very similar, Canada Bay, to what Long Beach had in mind. So their rezoning calls for 5,000 new units of housing, 1,000,005 square feet, that's about 150,000 square meters of office, another 400,000 square feet of retail, and those tourists need to sleep somewhere, so another 800 hotel rooms. The plan incentives beyond upzoning were to assure entitlement rights for developers on those parcels by conducting a master environmental impact report, by reducing parking rates, and by reducing processing time. We were asked to come in and quantify, once again as real estate economists, quantify that value conveyed to owners and developers from the upzoning and determine the extent to which, if any, that development could afford to support affordable housing set-asides and community benefits. So we set about to do that. The zone changes include 4 scenarios that we examined. So basically heights were capped at 6 stories or 100 feet in Long Beach under the old plan. They went up to 240 feet under the new plan. We looked at 4 development products. Apartments. What we mean by apartments, this is like ordering coffee in Australia. I get confused. Is it a long black, a tall black, a short black, a flat white? So for you, an apartment is an owner home, right? No? Yes? Anyway, for us, an apartment is a rental unit. So when I say apartment, as a Yank, I mean a rental unit. Apartments, condominiums, ownership units, offices, and hotels. Each of these prototypes had some street-level retail. And we conducted this exercise that I suggest to you, you have to master before you can have an effective strategy. Land residual value analysis is the holy grail of real estate development and investment. Without it, no developer, no lender, no investor would spend a dime. And land residual value analysis predicts, hopefully accurately, the value of the land after we calculate the income potential of the project and subtract away the cost of developing that project, inclusive of developer profit. I want to say that again. So we're projecting the capitalized value of the income potential of the project, whether it's rental apartments, owner condominiums, an office building, or a hotel, or a restaurant. And we're subtracting out what it costs to build that project, hard costs, soft costs, financing costs, professional fees, developer profit, impact fees from the local jurisdiction. The difference is the value of the land. And if the land value is negative, what happens? Is that project going to get built and financed? No, it's not feasible. In fact, if it's near flat or break even, is that project going to get built or financed? That's correct, because the risk is too great. We're talking about investing hundreds of millions of dollars in single projects, and to have narrow margins with that risk is unacceptable. So we did that analysis, and we quantified the benefit by defining it as a positive increase in land residual value from the old zoning compared to the new zoning. Under current market economics, interestingly, that high-rise development, 240 feet, was not feasible. This was in 2011. Today, very feasible. But as market conditions improved, as we saw, it could be quite profitable. So the charts I'm about to show you illustrate the change in land value from the old zoning to the new zoning. And I want to take a minute to talk about these charts, and I'm sorry they're a little small for those of you in the back. But what we see here are 4 sets of bars, left to right, that show 4 development scenarios from floor area ratios of 4.0 to 8.0 and heights up to 240 feet. And we did this for the 4 prototypes. This is the apartment, the rental prototype. And the purple bars above that midline, which is 0, show the increase in land value from the zone change, okay? And so that's dollars per square foot. So you can see that the highest and best use was at about a floor area ratio of 4.0, and the increased value was $65 a square foot for that market rate apartment. Very profitable. $65 a square foot, $650 a square meter, approximately. Now, the green bars behind show the value uplift, or the negative value, when we require that 10% of those apartments be affordable at very low income rents. No subsidy. This is internal to the pro forma for the apartment project. And you can see we still have positive land value of $17 a square foot. This is a viable pro forma, and this project would proceed. We looked at ownership condominiums, and we found even better economics, with land values market rate at $45 a square foot, but after requiring 15% of the ownership units be affordable at moderate income families, that Hayward example, for example, we still see land values increasing by nearly $20 a square foot. Now, what happens on the far right is, remember I said the high-rise development wasn't economic? It's because the cost of building type 1 steel frame construction is quite substantial, and the value, the rents and sale prices from those apartments and condominiums doesn't support those costs in 2011. The office market in Long Beach in 2011 was where? In the tank, right? Not viable. It actually hasn't changed that much today. But look at the hotel market. Remember I said a lot of people like to go to Long Beach? Well, this is proof. So the room rates, the income potential, support the development costs for the hotel with massive uplift of $120 a square foot. And here we're not setting aside apartment rooms as, hotel rooms as apartments, right? We're assessing a fee, $10 a square foot to the trust fund to finance and subsidize low-income rental housing. Even after that $10 fee, $100 in increased land value. The last thing we did in Long Beach was, remember those incentives, parking reductions, accelerated processing, and the like? Well, we wanted to know how much those contributed to land value. And what we saw was the lion's share of benefit came from the parking reduction. Look, it costs $20,000 to $40,000 a square foot, a parking space to build. So when you reduce that obligation, you materially contribute to the bottom line of land value. I have an architect friend who is a fabulous affordable housing designer in the States, and he likes to say, why is it that we need to hear the heartbeat of our SUV when we sleep in our bedroom in a garage next to us? You can see the cost of requiring that parking obligation. What did this mean? Remember the build-out was 5,000 units from the uplift? It means that we could set aside 750 units, 15%, without subsidy from the land value capture in Long Beach. Very powerful tool. Before closing, I'm going to skip the economic impact work that we did in Long Beach as well, which we can get into in the Q&A and if people like. But I want to revisit what we've learned in 6 decades of practice. The first lesson is we need to create a national consensus of how to define affordable housing and affordable housing expense in quantitative terms tied to income level, not rhetorical labels. We need to create permanent, annually renewable, dedicated sources of public capital to fill the financing gap. We need to create durable, institutional, public-private partnerships with developers, lenders, investors, property managers, asset managers to protect, preserve, and develop this key, precious asset. We need to implement state-of-the-art land value capture policies and provide for their deployment in affordable housing. We need to treat affordable rental housing as what might be labeled key community infrastructure. What I mean by that is we're creating a private asset, privately developed, owned, and operated. This is not on the social housing model, and this is not to suggest we ignore that asset. We need to revitalize that stock. But we're now creating a new institutional asset class for Australia, and we're creating an industry supply chain capable of building it, financing it, and operating it for a very long, useful economic life. I would suggest up to a century. And that we need to include for-profit, nonprofit developers, community developers, social housing authorities, property and asset managers in that capacity building effort. And I'm struck, Ian, by the relative absence of lenders and investors in the conference here today. While we might not have your 12,000 person population in our conferences, we do have massive participation by the private sector financial community for both debt and equity when we talk about affordable housing in our conference setting. And treat it as a permanent asset. Lastly, what I mean by resolving the ambiguity of affordable home ownership is this. You remember the Hayward case example where the gaps were a couple $100,000 for an ownership unit, and the source of that money is going to be taxpayer funds? Well, when we sell that home price restricted with a gap of $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 a door, are we giving that family a win at the lottery where they can then turn around and sell the house at market rate and reap the windfall? Is that really what we intend? Or are rather we restricting resale time over time over time to some modest appreciation, but allowing a similarly placed family at a similar income level the affordability of the dream of home ownership? And with that dream, I want you to return to that memory that we started with, of being a kid in your home and feeling safe and secure. And I want to suggest to you as we think forward and hopefully shift that optimism chart, that we hold that dream in our minds so that your next generation and the next generation of Australians don't suffer the crisis in affordability that we experience today. Thank you very much.
To facilitate the question and answer session with Dr. Rosen, please welcome Executive Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, Dr. Ian Winter.
Yes, thank you. That was terrific. David, the depth of your analysis I think is particularly striking. I want to remind people to use the app to send in some questions. I've got some terrific questions here. We're also going to have some roving mics. Whilst those questions are coming in, I think what's in some ways quite striking about David's analysis, I mean, our sense of the United States is this sort of land of the free, let the market rip. Yet what you've talked about here is a very sort of tight, detailed partnership between governments and the private sector and the not-for-profits to generate a supply of affordable housing. So you were talking, one of your last points was about the national consensus. I wonder if you can sort of just talk to us a little bit about how did that national consensus get built? Was there some sort of crisis that triggered it all? Or was there a slow burn here? Because there's obviously a lot of things that we've got to try and put into place to enable this sort of complexity of instruments and institutions to come together to drive the supply.
So there are two definitions of affordability, right? Owners and renters. And it's very important we not forget the homeless and those with incomes that are so low that they can afford to pay effectively nothing for their shelter. But that said, in the 30s and 40s, the definition was 25% of household income for rent, not 30. And it didn't include an allowance for utilities. And it evolved, I would say, by the 80s to that 30% standard. We do have our equivalent of CRA as well in the United States. And I didn't talk about vouchers, and we should talk about vouchers and how those can be deployed to develop and preserve housing, not just represent a cash transfer from tenants to landlords. The voucher system is 30% of income for rent, and it goes up and down, and the voucher pays the difference. However, in the tax credit model, we fix the rent, as I showed you in the Hayward example and in the New York City example. And some people will be overpaying a little bit, some people will be underpaying, but that fixed rent is financeable because it provides certainty. And so the fixing of the rent, defined as affordable, was key to attracting massive private capital into rental housing. On the ownership side, I dare say we messed up big time, right? Not so much on affordable housing, but in the subprime crisis, we really forgot that fundamental mortgage repayment obligation. And we didn't do anyone any favors by putting them into a loan that they couldn't afford. 10 million Americans lost their home to foreclosure in the crisis. So that consensus emerged over time, but the affordable rent level has been put to bed now for 35 years. We're quite clear that that's the standard we need to operate under.
There's a question come in from questions come in from Steve Pomeroy, basically asking about whether or not there are cultural specificities that mean that some of these things can't be exported, particularly the sort of reliance on the tax mechanisms. But I mean, you're suggesting here that you think that this is obviously a framework that can be taken up in a range of different countries.
Well, I refer back to the crazy ant in the basement, right? It's not as if you're not already spending tax subsidies on real estate. You are. The question is, what are you getting for that expenditure by way of public benefit? And what is the effect of the current tax system in Australia on real estate, and specifically on housing? So I'm certainly not smart, experienced, or astute enough to know the culture of taxation in Australia. But even what little I've learned suggests, Ian, that you have opportunities to refine that. So if, for example, negative gearing cost the Treasury $4 billion a year, and we were to save 10% of that a year, $500 million, and devote that to a tax credit program annually over each of 10 years, as is the case in the US model, you'd be generating billions of dollars for equity investment in low-income housing too, at no net increase to the Treasury. So I think it's important, as I believe is underway, to examine your current tax system and to think a bit more strategically about how those tax subsidies might be deployed to solve this issue. Yeah. I was interested in Gavin's remarks. I don't know if he's here this morning, but he talked about shifting from a capital gains tax deferral mechanism to a land tax mechanism. And the tax increment financing model we talked about is a land tax model that is very powerful to produce an ongoing source of support for affordable housing as well.
Okay. And a question's come in from Adam Farrar about the sort of you've very purposefully gone through the requirement to define and measure need. And I think one of the things that's very striking is not only recognising the geography of real estate economics, that you've got to do these calculations in specific sort of markets because they differ dramatically, but then they're very tight measurement. But Adam's asking a question about how has the US actually gone on meeting that need? What are some of the outcome measures? So you've measured the need. There's obviously been at the national level a big investment, multiple units. Is there a sort of a post hoc evaluation of how much need has been met and whether or not the markets are now meeting the need that's there?
Right, not enough. Okay. We have this birthday exercise, right? So in the United States, if we were to take severely cost-burdened families below 50% of the median income, Ian, we would characterize those and do as worst-case housing needs. We have 10 million families in the United States. That's about 9% of all families, and it's about 23% of all renters who are severely cost-burdened. And this is after the production of tax credit housing, after the production of housing trust fund, inclusionary housing, tax increment financing, and public housing. So not nearly enough. I mean, speaking of the crazy ant in the bedroom, I spared you the slides about our mortgage interest deduction, right? But anybody want to guess what the tax expenditure total is annually to subsidize home ownership in the US? We spend $7 billion on the tax credit program, $200 billion, and it's intensely regressive in its distribution of benefits.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's get some questions from the floor too. People may have questions and comments they want to make. There's one in the middle there. I can see if we can get a microphone to the middle row of the middle section. Probably the most inconvenient place, but that's fine. Any other hands in the air on other parts? Throw your hands in the air of... Oh, thank you. There's one down at the front there. We can have a microphone travelling to the front here, please.
Hello. Oh, yeah. My question is, I mean, what you've talked about is a whole range...
Could you just say who you are and where you're from, please?
I'm sorry. My name's John Storer. I'm a director with the Housing Trust in Wollongong. I was going to say, yeah, what you've outlined is a whole range of different mechanisms for transferring wealth from one sector of society to another. Just the thing that interests me is why is there the political will to have these systems of transfer in the United States, but in Australia we don't seem to have the political will to implement them?
You know, I think nothing breeds success like success. So the tax credit program is intensely successful, as I quickly summarized. The legislation was permanently authorized by the US Congress which permanently authorizes almost nothing, about, I'm going to guess, I think in 2008. And out of 535 members of Congress, there were 400 co-sponsors for that bill. 400 people wanted to sign up and say, I'll do that, let alone vote for it. Contrast that to public housing and vouchers. So Congress has been cutting the annual budget for vouchers, and we spend $44 billion a year on vouchers, about 4 million vouchers in the US, and that number is declining. And the investment in public housing, about 1.4 million units of public housing, is, as I've said, woefully inadequate. And what you see among states and cities, as you, I think, would expect and probably experience here in Australia, is a wide diversity of political will. Some states like California have, and New York City have very strong commitments. Richmond, which has desperate need, has almost no political will. Richmond has done very little to address that need. So it's variable. I think what gives me optimism is groups like this and the role of advocacy in partnership with the private sector can be very influential with policymakers at every level of government.
There's a number of questions coming on the app around the housing or inclusionary zoning is the sort of term that we use. Questions like, how do you know what level to strike, in terms of the requirement? Some places it's 15%, sometimes it's 30%. How do you go about doing that?
Can we call up the presentation?
And also questions about the level of subsidy. Is there a level, what's the level of subsidy and how does that get managed? And you have some figures on that. And also questions about, so when you do create this supply of affordable dwellings, are they simply gifted to the not-for-profits to manage in perpetuity?
Isn't that 5 questions in one?
Yeah. Well, I've got gazillions of questions here.
Is this not Chatham House rules? I mean, I'm confused. I thought folks were polite here.
Not on an iPad. You give them some anonymity.
Okay.
It's extraordinary.
This is my quiz, right? Let me see if I can remember. How do we gauge levels of affordability? So remember I said we did an economic impact analysis in Long Beach, so, and I skipped those slides. I'm calling one of them up for you. So this is high-rise apartments, type 1 steel frame construction. The left-hand bar is current zoning. The right-hand bar, very high increase in land value. It's $300 a square foot increase in residual land value, is new zoning, market rate, no set-aside. The next bar is 5% of the units set aside as very low income. And you can see that that land value is equivalent to current land value, so highly feasible. Now we drop down to a more aggressive standard of 10% set aside. And what happens to land value? This is your turn. Right, it's negative. So what that means is we've gone too far. For this project, this prototype, this point in time in this market's economics. We need to make sure that we're astute about real estate cycles because that's how developers and investors think about real estate investment. So this type of analysis tells you how to calibrate your targeting. The second question was subsidy?
Yeah.
So let's say that as policymakers, we want that 10% set aside, right, where we've driven land values negative. So how do we boost that back up over the line? By injecting some subsidy. And that might be done by the tax credit program or infusions from the local housing trust fund. So what we're now doing is talking about layering sources of financing. Remember that capital plan of Bloomberg's, the sources and uses for the whole production plan? We do a similar financial pro forma of sources and uses for each project. And there might be a small permanent loan supported by net operating income rent. There might be a contribution from the developer for inclusionary. There might be a housing trust fund subsidy from the local government. And there might be some third source layered in. We typically find, it's not uncommon in the United States in privately developed affordable rental to see 4, 5, or 6 sources of financing to layer it in. There was a third question.
Gifting of the supply to the not-for-profits.
I think this is a kind of a let a thousand flowers bloom kind of strategy, meaning, yes, in some cases the land from private development is deeded over to private nonprofits to develop and do that kind of capital stack I described. In other cases, the for-profit developer will simply operate those units as part of their mixed income project. Very, very common. So it's a wide range of practice.
And so you talked earlier about, I think, in the low-income housing tax credits, 25% of the total are run by the not-for-profits, 75% by the for. So what's driving that mix? I mean, are the not-for-profits at a sort of a lower end of the rental sort of, what explains that mix? Why isn't it 50-50?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, I'm going to say I don't know. Okay. It might be limits on capacity of the nonprofit sector. Look, the business model for the credit program, whether you're a nonprofit does not mean non-income, hopefully, right? Otherwise you can't exist, right? So what the credit program demonstrates is it's very profitable. I think the reason for this heavy participation of nonprofits is it's their mission to do so, and they've organized themselves to develop capacity and frankly compete with the for-profit sector.
Okay. Let's get another question from the floor. Yes, thanks, Julie.
Hello, my name is Julie Lawson.
Just, mic's not working at the moment. Number 2.
Hello?
Yeah.
My name is Julie Lawson, and I'm very, very interested in what you've been doing, and your presentation is excellent, so thank you very, very much. I have a question about the implications of all these instruments could mean for also public housing, so public housing authorities, and how are they able, through the public housing program under HUD, are they able to actually access all these additional sources of investment? What has the rental assistance demonstration program meant for them in terms of being able to access project-based vouchers for the transferal of their assets into companies? Perhaps I mention this because the lack of investment in public housing in Australia is a real problem, and it's not just about growing an alternative, it's also about a multi-provider system. So what are the implications of some of these instruments could mean for reinvigorating perhaps also a renaissance in public housing in Australia?
Well, one part of your question is especially astute, and that's recognizing the cash flow financeable value of rent assistance, or CRA, or NRAS. So I mentioned we spend $44 billion a year on vouchers. Contrast that with $7 billion a year on tax credits. And in the United States, the housing authorities, I think unlike here, administer both public housing and vouchers. So vouchers aren't administered by states or the feds, they're administered by the local housing authorities. New York City, as I said, has 91,000 vouchers and 175,000 units of housing. So we have multiple problems, but one important strategy is to treat vouchers as the cash flow revenue that it is, project-based the vouchers, that is, tie it long-term, 30 years, to a development, a specific project, and then pledge those voucher payments as repayment to a loan that you secure to rehabilitate the housing. So I did a little math on this, and if you were to take, actually the minister said in his remarks that you're spending in fiscal year 2016 $6.6 billion on CRA. Earlier, the number I had was 4.4, so I did the math on 4.4. But if we take just 10% of the current expenditure of 4.4 billion, 440 million, let's call it $500 million, and diverted that to project-based assistance, right, as you suggested, and financed that at 5% for 30 years, we would produce $6.8 billion in proceeds today. Now, at $150,000 a door, and I don't know what the per unit cost is to reinvest and rehabilitate, reinvigorate social housing units, but let's take that as an average. That would pay for 45,000 units, which is about 20%, about 15% of the stock. So if you did that over 3 times, you would revitalize half the social housing stock in Australia. with no net increase to the outlays currently experienced. I mean, the minister exhorted us to be smarter. Well, there's one suggestion. I think the other challenge is the deferral of reinvestment in the social housing stock. So if it's transferred to a community housing provider and it's a wreck and the cash flow is negative, no thank you. I mean, unless you're giving me a viable business model to take stewardship of that critical asset, I can't be held responsible for running it responsibly. So you're going to have to reinvent, as we in the States must. I mean, we haven't fixed this either, to be sure, the business model for social housing.
David, thank you. I mean, another one of the questions that's sort of coming in here, and it's a question specifically coming from Phil Fagan-Schmidt, and it's a question often asked by the politicians. Yeah, and it's one of, what's the ultimate level of sort of affordable rental or ownership properties that we should be striving for? What's the mix here? Should we be saying it's 80% full market, 20% sort of somewhat below market in various sort of shades? Do you have a sense, I mean, is there a figure in the US that you're striving for in terms of your market, non-market mix?
So in just about any developed economy, the bottom 40% of wage earners can't afford their housing expense. In other words, they're making a trade-off between paying the rent or paying the health insurance or child care or putting food on the table. Because there just isn't enough money to go around in the family budget. That's a big number, right? So that's 4 out of 10 households. And the capital cost of providing that would be probably ruinous. So I think you're going to need to make a Solomon-like decision of what level of public investment you're willing to make to resolve the affordable housing crisis, and where you would choose to deploy those assets among, say, worst-case housing needs, Q1 paying more than 50%, for example, or to take Gavin's talk, that cohort of, if not 25 to 34-year-olds. I don't think I want my 27-year-old daughter owning a house right now, okay? Not quite sure she's there. But maybe 35 to 45, I don't mean to joke about it, but the issue of first-time home ownership and how we continue that personal investment. I don't think there's any alchemy there. I think Australia needs to answer that question for Australians. But clearly not enough is being done, and the outlays that are currently being expended, as your question suggests, and as the minister, I think, also suggested, might be more strategically deployed.
And there's also a bundle of questions coming through about, I guess, how far down into the sort of income distribution can the sort of subsidy arrangements that the US is using reach? I mean, are you able to provide solutions for homeless people, for people on very, very low incomes? Does the sort of the tax mix and the subsidy mix, is it able to reach that far down?
So let's talk about the homeless issue for a minute, because now we're talking about folks who really have no income to pay rent. So that's not a financing model, right? I mean, if we're putting a homeless person or a person at near risk of homelessness into shelter and providing them social services, we can't expect them to be paying hundreds of dollars a month to pay for that, right? So that's an outright subsidy. So what can be done? Well, again, the minister alluded to this in social impact bonds. And the idea here is that, returning to this dream of a stable home as a child, so if we have a stable place to call home, provided and supported by the provision of services, mental health, substance abuse, disability support services, job training, transitional services, it relieves the budgetary pressures on the criminal justice system, on the emergency rooms of our hospital and public health system. It relieves pressure and costs on the mental health system. So we can, as the minister noted, take the savings, the budgetary savings from outlays for emergency services, and use them instead to finance and pay for supportive services and stable housing. And that social impact bond or pay-per-performance type of bond, I think it has promise for getting down to the problem of homeless shelter, permanent shelter, I don't mean temporary, and supportive services.
Okay, thank you. Just again, hands in the air if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll try and get a microphone to you. We've also got a couple of questions come in via the app. about disincentives. So if landlords aren't providing affordable housing, should we be penalising them in some way?
Well, no, right? I mean, if they bought into private housing under a certain regimen, I don't think so. But I would return to the negative gearing, deferred capital gains question. And that's not so much a question about the landlord, but what is the Treasury getting for its expenditure by way of a public purpose and common good? And I think that question deserves to be answered.
And you're a fairly frequent visitor to Australia, and you've observed sort of a fair bit of our sort of...
I still can't order coffee.
Well, yeah. You'll need to spend a lot of time.
I hate boxed jellyfish, okay? So I'm deathly afraid of sharks.
The Shark Tank is next. So,
yeah. I'm nervous, very nervous.
There are a number of questions here about, I guess, our capability, both at the sort of individuals, at the organisational level, institutional sort of level. Do you have a sort of sense of are we sufficiently tooled up, or do we need to sort of invest in particular parts of our capacity to try and take this conversation forward?
I think so. Again, I'm such a newbie here. I'm uncomfortable. But my impressions, particularly from this conference, I spoke to a number of you in the community housing sector, and the impression I come away from those discussions with is there's a lot more balance sheet strength and capacity there than I initially thought. I mean, my understanding is you have about 90,000 units under ownership. I'm not talking about management contracts now, but ownership. Is that number right? No? What's the right number? Anybody know? It's not right, okay. See, there I'm back to my coffee problem. Less than 10,000 units in ownership by community housing organizations?
No.
If that's accurate, I would say, yeah, that's a concern.
Yeah.
I mean, look, you're facing the need to reinvest in 320,000 units of social housing that really shouldn't be accepted on an asset transfer if you can't have the financial support to maintain and reinvest in it. You're facing unmet needs of hundreds of thousands of units. So that scale, 10,000 against hundreds of thousands, is a mismatch. So yes, I think investing in the capacity of that mission-driven nonprofit development sector in partnership with the for-profit development sector, the Lend-Leases and the Frasers and the others of the world who have a tremendous development and financing capacity, in partnership with banks and supers, would develop a new investment class. And I think one strategy that would be worth looking deeply into is the role foundations played in the United States in the 1980s to build up the capacity of the nonprofit community housing sector. And that took 20 years. And so it's going to take, I was talking with one of you at one of the breaks, and I circled a number of maybe $50 million in grant support over 10 years, $5 million a year, to build up that capacity, to do the real estate economics I described, to do the project financing and structuring, which is quite sophisticated that I described, to work with for-profit partners and not have them eat your lunch, okay? But respect the talent and value and capital they have to bring to the table. I think investing in that sector is probably worth doing here.
Okay, thank you. We're starting to press time, so I'm going to take, there's a question right up the back. If you could please make it short and sharp, that'd be great.
No worries. I'm Janelle Veach from the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, and we currently have Western Australia's only inclusionary zoning policy. So I was just interested in how, I guess, places around the US manage the shift in the market if, I guess, with the global financial crisis, if all of the inclusionary zoning policies were reassessed to adjust the percentage requirement, or I guess that dependence on the market and how that's managed.
You know, it's a beautiful accent, but I had trouble understanding you. Can you translate for me?
No.
Hi, I'm Janelle.
I think it was an ask for a long black. But, sorry, just give us the pithy part at the end. And hold the mic in close.
Did you adjust the percentage requirement when the market shifted, say, for example, with the global financial crisis?
I see. Is the question, what happens to inclusionary policies when we go into crisis?
Yes.
Essentially. So The mayor of San Jose, California, the second largest city in California, when we helped adopt in 2008 the inclusionary housing mandate for that city, was dead opposed to it. And it was not going to get adopted by the city council. Until we showed some slides, which I don't have here today, but I can send you if you like, where we looked at the land sale prices in a 4-year period from 2005 through 2008. So before the crisis and then into the teeth of the crisis. And we correlated the land sale prices with zoning and density and land use. So we were looking specifically at residential uses for owner and renter housing at different densities for different prototypes, from single-family subdivisions to high-rise towers. And what we found was pretty amazing. We found that the change in land price in a mere 2 to 4 years was as much as 120%. Put another way, land price is intensely volatile based on speculation. And the city of San Jose did nothing, right? They were just standing by. They didn't change their general plan. They didn't change their design code. They didn't change their zoning. So doing nothing, land prices were all over. And that market volatility convinced the mayor and his colleagues on the council that imposing a moderate requirement would be absorbed in the residual land values over time. Remember I said don't look at this just in a snapshot. So I think you need to do the economics as I just suggested in that last red slide from Long Beach, so you're not overreaching, but recognize that you're operating in a business cycle and target your obligations within that cycle range.
Let's try and squeeze in one last question with the mic down in the front here on my right. Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. Mark Fowler. Just a quick question. We've been talking about, over here, we've been talking about the not-for-profit sector and using that term, but of course a subset of that sector within Australia is the charitable sector. So there's a question that arises in these kind of schemes, for example, illustrated by the NRAS. When the NRAS was brought through in 2008, there was a parliamentary extension of what is known as the legal definition of charitable purposes within Australia to clarify that the tenant profile mix that were able to be supported by NRAS were charitable, because there was a question as to whether or not they met the relief of poverty head. And recently the ACNC, the Charity Commission here, has released a statement defining what charities can do in the housing space. I'm just wondering if there's any attention been given to that in the US, and I wonder if that speaks to your 25%, 75% participation in the lower income housing tax credit scheme.
To answer the first question, we pay a hell of a lot of attention to that. You might characterize the low-income housing tax credit program as the Full Employment Act for tax attorneys and accountants. So we have a similar construct in U.S. tax law called safe harbor. And the safe harbor provisions stipulate the requirements for charitable mission or nonprofit tax exempt status. We don't use the term charity. So the IRS grants a tax exempt status. So to continue that tax exempt status, you must meet safe harbor requirements for your business operations. And in housing, what that means is no more than 20% of the units you develop and operate may be affordable to families above 80% of the area median income. So, and that's at a portfolio level. Now, tax attorneys get kind of nervous when a nonprofit, say, develops a 100% market rate project of 100 units, but they have 2,000 units in portfolio, so that's well under their safe harbor. But what are they doing with a 100% for-profit market rate project? So there is some squat. I mean, I love tax attorneys. It's like Talmudic scholars. It always changes. But yes, in brief, we do pay a lot of attention to that, and the IRS guidance is clear, as I noted. And what was your second question? Okay.
And we're out of time. Please thank Dr. David Paul Rosen for a fabulous address. Thank you.